Sometimes the smallest mistake opens the only door destiny ever intended you to find. Heat season arrived 2 weeks earlier than anyone had predicted, and by the second night the royal sanctuary inside Blackwood Citadel had become so crowded that every hallway echoed with weary footsteps and whispered prayers. Every bed was occupied. Every chair had become a place to rest. Even blankets spread across the polished stone floor disappeared before midnight. Evelyn Carter moved quietly through the endless rows of patients with steady hands that refused to tremble despite the exhaustion pulling at every muscle in her body. At 22 years old, the young Omega healer had already learned that kindness often demanded more than comfort. She replaced cool cloths on feverish foreheads, prepared fresh herbal remedies, reassured frightened children separated from their parents, and stayed beside lonely elders until they finally drifted into peaceful sleep. Long after other healers had finished their shifts, Evelyn remained, believing no patient should ever wake alone during the most difficult nights of the year. She had not eaten a proper meal since sunrise, and the lantern she carried felt heavier with every passing hour, yet she never complained. When a frightened mother arrived carrying a sleeping little girl wrapped in a faded blanket, Evelyn quietly offered them the small cot that had been reserved for her. "You need it more than I do," she said with a gentle smile. The grateful woman tried to refuse, but Evelyn simply adjusted the blanket around the child before walking away without waiting for another word. By the time the sanctuary bell announced midnight, the last remaining treatment room had filled, and even the storage areas had been transformed into temporary resting spaces. Director Miriam Caldwell apologized to every exhausted healer because there truly was nowhere left for anyone to sleep. Evelyn smiled softly and assured her she would find an empty corner somewhere inside the castle. She believed it. She wanted to believe it. Carrying her folded cloak over one arm, she stepped into the quiet corridors of Blackwood Citadel. Unlike the crowded sanctuary, the royal halls rested beneath peaceful silence. Moonlight spilled through towering windows, painting silver reflections across marble floors, while distant torches flickered against ancient stone walls. The castle seemed almost unreal after the noise she had left behind. She opened one guest room after another, only to discover each already occupied by traveling officials, visiting physicians, or palace staff temporarily relocated because of the overwhelming number of patients. With every closed door, her footsteps grew slower. Her vision blurred from fatigue. She could barely remember the last time she had slept for more than 3 consecutive hours. Somewhere deep inside the royal residence, she noticed one final wooden door standing slightly open. Warm firelight glowed softly from within. The room appeared untouched, peaceful, and completely empty. She hesitated. Surely someone would have closed the door if it belonged to another guest. Whispering a quiet apology to whoever might return before morning, she stepped inside. The chamber was elegant without being extravagant. A crackling fireplace filled the room with gentle warmth. Tall bookshelves lined one wall. Heavy curtains swayed slightly beside an open balcony where cool mountain air drifted through the room. Everything felt calm, inviting, and impossibly still. Evelyn removed her worn boots, folded her cloak neatly across the foot of the large bed, and sat down for what she promised herself would be only a few minutes. The soft mattress welcomed her aching body more gently than she expected. Before she could gather enough strength to stand again, her eyes slowly closed. Within moments, she had fallen into the deepest sleep she had known in weeks, never realizing that the peaceful room surrounding her belonged not to an ordinary guest, but to Lucian Ashford, the Alpha King himself, who was already riding home beneath the moonlit sky after completing a week-long inspection of the kingdom's northern borders. The rhythmic sound of horses approaching the inner courtyard echoed through the sleeping castle long before the palace guards announced the return of their ruler. Lucian Ashford dismounted with the quiet confidence of a man who carried responsibility every hour of every day. Dust from the northern roads still clung to the hem of his dark cloak, and the cool mountain air followed him through the towering gates as Captain Rowan Hale walked a respectful step behind, offering a brief summary of routine matters that had arisen during the week-long inspection. Lucian listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions about harvest supplies, village repairs, and preparations for the unusually early heat season. The reports confirmed what he had already witnessed beyond the capital. Shelters were full. Healers were overwhelmed. Families had traveled farther than expected seeking care. Even so, he had not imagined the strain had reached the heart of Blackwood Citadel itself. As they entered the royal residence, the familiar silence of the palace wrapped around them. Most corridors remained dim except for scattered lanterns that burned through the night. Servants quietly bowed before returning to their duties, careful not to disturb the peaceful stillness. Lucian thanked Captain Rowan for his service and dismissed the remaining attendants, preferring a few moments of solitude before sunrise. The journey home had been long, and although fatigue settled across his shoulders, he looked forward to nothing more than several hours of uninterrupted rest before another demanding day began. He climbed the final staircase leading toward his private chamber, noticing that the door stood slightly open. That alone was unusual. Every member of the palace staff understood that his room was always secured before his return. He slowed his pace, not with suspicion but with quiet curiosity. Pushing the door open without a sound, he stopped just inside the entrance. Someone was asleep in his bed. Moonlight spilled gently across the room, illuminating the peaceful figure resting beneath a neatly folded blanket. The young woman had not disturbed anything. Her worn boots sat carefully beside the bed. Her weathered cloak had been folded with remarkable care across the footboard. Even the books resting on the nearby table remained exactly where he had left them before departing several days earlier. Nothing suggested carelessness or disrespect. Instead, the room carried an unexpected sense of calm. Lucian studied her face for several silent moments. She looked impossibly exhausted. Faint shadows rested beneath closed eyes, and loose strands of chestnut hair framed features softened by the deepest sleep. Her hands, resting loosely above the blanket, revealed tiny scratches, fading marks from countless hours preparing herbal medicines, changing bandages, and lifting supplies. These were not the hands of someone seeking comfort through privilege. They were the hands of someone who had forgotten how to rest. As he quietly set aside his traveling gloves, the sleeping Omega shifted slightly and murmured almost too softly to hear, "Please let everyone have a bed tonight." The words barely rose above a whisper before silence returned. Lucian remained still. She had not spoken his name. She had not pleaded for herself. Even in sleep, her thoughts belonged to someone else. He glanced toward the fireplace, then back to the unfamiliar young healer whose peaceful breathing filled the otherwise empty chamber. Captain Rowan, noticing the unusually long delay outside, approached cautiously before stopping at the doorway. His eyes widened with surprise, and he instinctively reached for the door, prepared to summon the palace guards. Lucian lifted one hand, quietly stopping him before a single word could be spoken. Rowan lowered his voice to a whisper. "Your Majesty, shall I wake her?" Lucian looked once more at the sleeping Omega before answering with calm certainty. "No." Rowan appeared puzzled. "She has clearly mistaken this room for another." Lucian nodded slightly. "Then we should first understand why such a mistake became possible." Instead of anger, an unexpected question settled into his thoughts. What kind of night had left a young healer so exhausted that she could wander into the most protected room inside the castle without ever realizing where she had fallen asleep? The first rays of morning sunlight slipped through the tall windows, replacing silver moonlight with soft golden warmth that slowly filled the royal chamber. Evelyn stirred beneath the blanket, her tired body finally surrendering the deep sleep it had desperately needed. For one peaceful moment, she forgot where she was. The mattress felt far too comfortable to belong inside the crowded sanctuary, and the gentle crackle of the fireplace sounded unfamiliar. She blinked slowly, lifting herself onto one elbow as her eyes wandered across elegant bookshelves, polished wooden furniture, finely woven curtains, and the royal crest carved above the fireplace. Confusion crossed her face before understanding arrived all at once. Her heart skipped. She was not inside a guest room. She had never seen this chamber before, yet every detail whispered the same impossible truth. Someone important lived here. She immediately climbed out of the bed, gathering her folded cloak with trembling hands. Before she could reach the door, it opened quietly. Lucian Ashford stepped inside, now dressed in simple royal clothing instead of the travel cloak he had worn during the night. Captain Rowan Hale remained respectfully behind him. Evelyn froze completely. Her eyes widened as they settled on the unmistakable silver emblem embroidered across Lucian's jacket. Every healer in Blackwood Citadel recognized that symbol. Color disappeared from her face. She lowered her gaze at once, clutching her cloak tightly against herself. "Your Majesty," she whispered, barely able to find her voice. "I am so sorry." The room remained silent for several long seconds. Evelyn expected raised voices, accusations, perhaps immediate punishment for entering the private chamber of the Alpha King. Instead, she heard calm footsteps approaching. Lucian stopped several feet away, giving her enough space to breathe. His expression showed curiosity rather than anger. "Please look at me," he said gently. Nervously, Evelyn raised her eyes. "Tell me how you came here." She swallowed hard, ashamed by the mistake yet unwilling to hide behind excuses. "The sanctuary was completely full," she answered honestly. "Every patient needed a place to rest. I gave my cot to a mother and her daughter. Director Miriam said there were no rooms left anywhere. I searched for an empty guest room, but every door I opened was occupied. When I found this room, the door was already slightly open. I believed it belonged to another traveler. I only meant to sit down for a few minutes before leaving." She lowered her head again. "I never intended any disrespect." Lucian listened without interrupting. He noticed the embarrassment in her voice and the sincerity in every word. Nothing about her story sounded rehearsed. She was simply exhausted. Captain Rowan frowned thoughtfully before speaking. "Your Majesty, I visited the sanctuary yesterday evening before your return. She is telling the truth. Every available bed was occupied. Even storage rooms had become temporary sleeping areas." Lucian looked toward his captain. "Were additional guest rooms requested?" Rowan nodded once. "Several requests were submitted during the past month. I assumed accommodations had already been arranged." A thoughtful silence settled over the room. Lucian turned back toward Evelyn. "What is your name?" "Evelyn Carter, Your Majesty." "How long have you served at the sanctuary?" "Almost 4 years. And after working through the entire night, your first concern was giving your own bed to someone else." Evelyn looked slightly confused by the question. "The little girl needed real sleep more than I did." She answered so naturally that it sounded less like kindness and more like simple common sense. Lucian studied her quietly. The answer lingered in the room far longer than either of them expected. He had met countless people eager to impress the crown with carefully chosen words. Evelyn had done the opposite. She had apologized repeatedly without mentioning a single sacrifice until he asked directly. Finally, Lucian spoke with calm certainty. "You entered this room by mistake, not by intention. No punishment will be given." Evelyn looked up in disbelief. Relief mixed with surprise across her face, but before she could thank him, Lucian's attention shifted beyond the mistake itself. If one devoted healer had wandered into the private chamber of the Alpha King simply because there was nowhere left for her to sleep, then the true problem was never the wrong door. The true problem was the system that had quietly allowed dedicated people like Evelyn to carry impossible burdens without anyone inside the palace fully seeing them. By the time Evelyn returned to the royal sanctuary, she hoped the strange morning would quietly disappear into memory. But castles had a way of giving ordinary moments extraordinary lives. Before noon, whispers drifted through corridors faster than any official announcement. Servants exchanged careful glances while carrying fresh linens. Palace attendants lowered their voices whenever someone approached. Guards standing watch near the inner courtyard repeated fragments of a story that seemed to grow more dramatic with every retelling. Some insisted an unknown Omega had deliberately entered the Alpha King's private chamber. Others claimed she had somehow earned special favor before sunrise. None of them knew the truth, yet certainty spread more quickly than facts ever could. Evelyn noticed the change immediately. Conversations paused as she passed through the sanctuary. A few curious faces followed her movements before politely looking away. She kept her attention fixed on her work, measuring herbs, replacing clean bandages, and checking the temperature of recovering patients exactly as she had done every day before. She refused to let rumors distract her from people who genuinely needed help. Director Miriam Caldwell quietly approached while Evelyn prepared another basket of medicines. Her expression carried equal parts concern and sympathy. "You have done nothing wrong," she said softly. "Please remember that." Evelyn offered a grateful smile, although uncertainty remained in her eyes. She had never wanted attention. She only wanted enough beds for everyone who came seeking care. Across the castle, Lucian sat inside the royal records chamber surrounded by shelves filled with years of carefully preserved reports. Thick ledgers rested across the large oak table, while Captain Rowan Hale and the chief administrative clerk sorted through stacks of official requests submitted by hospitals, shelters, and public services throughout the kingdom. Lucian turned each page with growing concentration. At first, the documents appeared routine. Budget summaries, maintenance schedules, staffing reports. Then patterns slowly emerged. Repeated requests from the royal sanctuary asking for additional sleeping quarters. Petitions recommending expanded treatment rooms. Letters warning that heat season had been arriving earlier in recent years. Many requests had been acknowledged. Very few had been approved. How long has this continued? Lucian asked quietly. The clerk lowered his eyes. Several years, Your Majesty. Lucian continued reading. Some requests carried notes recommending further review. Others had simply been postponed because funding had been directed toward more visible construction projects inside the capital. None of the decisions had been made with cruelty. They had simply been delayed again and again until temporary solutions quietly became permanent habits. Lucian closed the final ledger with measured calm. How many expansion proposals were submitted during the past 18 months? The clerk carefully counted the documents before answering. 17, Your Majesty. The number settled heavily over the room. 17 separate warnings had reached the palace, yet the system had continued expecting dedicated healers to solve impossible problems with limited resources. Captain Rowan remembered the exhausted young Omega who had fallen asleep without realizing where she was. If the sanctuary had received even one additional building, he said thoughtfully, she would never have searched for another room. Lucian nodded once, which means the mistake was never hers. At nearly the same moment, another conversation unfolded elsewhere inside Blackwood Citadel. Lady Vivian Blackthorne welcomed several influential nobles into her private sitting room overlooking the eastern gardens. Elegant porcelain cups rested untouched as polite smiles concealed growing concern. The kingdom is already discussing this unusual incident, one noble remarked carefully. Lady Vivian maintained perfect composure while gazing through the window. Stories become dangerous when they encourage people to forget proper boundaries. She replied with measured elegance. Compassion is admirable, but traditions exist for reasons. Although her words remained calm, her thoughts moved elsewhere. She had spent years believing that royal dignity depended upon flawless order. An unknown healer accidentally entering the Alpha King's chamber challenged that image more than she wished to admit. Back inside the records chamber, Lucian rose from his chair and walked toward the tall window overlooking both the palace and the distant roof of the royal sanctuary. From that height, the building seemed small compared with the vast castle surrounding it. Yet inside those walls, countless healers quietly carried burdens the palace had failed to notice. His gaze remained fixed on the sanctuary as a simple realization became impossible to ignore. A kingdom could not call itself strong if its most compassionate people had nowhere left to sleep. The following morning, the usual rhythm of Blackwood Citadel changed in ways that few people immediately understood. Royal messengers crossed the palace grounds carrying sealed orders instead of ceremonial invitations. Master builders, accountants, and senior administrators were summoned before breakfast. Even Captain Rowan Hale noticed that the Alpha King had canceled every non-essential audience, replacing them with meetings involving engineers, physicians, and public service officials. Lucian Ashford stood at the head of the council chamber beside a detailed map of the royal sanctuary. His expression remained calm, but there was unmistakable purpose in his voice. Effective immediately, he announced. Every unused guest room inside the palace will be prepared to house healers and patients whenever the sanctuary reaches capacity. Construction plans for additional treatment halls and permanent sleeping quarters will begin this week. Funding will be reassigned from decorative renovation projects that can wait. The health of our people cannot. The room fell into thoughtful silence. Several advisors exchanged surprised glances, yet none challenged the decision. The reports resting before them spoke clearly enough. 17 ignored requests had quietly become one undeniable truth. After the meeting ended, builders hurried toward the sanctuary carrying measuring tools. Instead of ceremonial blueprints, carpenters examined nearby courtyards where new buildings could rise without disturbing existing gardens. Supply wagons filled with timber, stone, blankets, furniture, and medical equipment rolled steadily through the castle gates. For the first time in years, the people working inside the sanctuary watched change begin with their own eyes rather than hearing another distant promise. Evelyn noticed the activity while carrying fresh herbs across the courtyard. Curious voices surrounded her as fellow healers wondered what had happened overnight. Director Miriam Caldwell gathered the staff together with visible emotion shining in her eyes. "The palace has approved the expansion," she announced. "Additional sleeping quarters, larger treatment rooms, more storage for medicine, and new staff accommodations. Construction begins today." A quiet wave of disbelief spread through the room before smiles slowly replaced exhaustion. Some healers laughed with relief, while others simply stood in stunned silence, hardly believing that years of waiting had finally come to an end. Evelyn looked toward the workers measuring the empty land beside the sanctuary and felt something warm settle quietly inside her heart. She never imagined that one accidental night could become the beginning of such meaningful change. Yet she refused to see herself as the reason. To her, the real victory belonged to every patient who would soon find a warm bed without another family sacrificing their comfort. Throughout the following days, Evelyn continued her routine exactly as before. She prepared medicines before sunrise, cleaned treatment rooms, comforted frightened children, and patiently taught younger healers how to recognize healing herbs by scent instead of appearance alone. She accepted no praise beyond a grateful smile, gently changing the subject whenever anyone thanked her for what the kingdom had begun calling the sanctuary reforms. One afternoon, Lucian quietly visited the construction site without formal ceremony. Wearing a simple dark coat instead of royal robes, he walked among the workers listening to their progress. From a short distance away, he noticed Evelyn kneeling beside an elderly patient beneath the shade of a large oak tree because every chair inside remained occupied until the expansion could be completed. She carefully adjusted the man's blanket, smiled at his granddaughter, and offered both of them the last cup of warm herbal tea she had prepared for herself. She never glanced around to see whether anyone had witnessed the gesture. She simply believed it was the right thing to do. Lucian watched in thoughtful silence. Power had allowed him to authorize buildings, approve budgets, and sign official decrees within a single morning. Evelyn possessed none of those privileges. Yet day after day, she changed lives through quiet choices that no official record would ever capture. For the first time in many years, Lucian realized that leadership was not measured only by commands issued from a throne. Sometimes the strongest foundation of an entire kingdom was built by ordinary people whose compassion remained unchanged even when no one was watching. Several months passed, and the sound of hammers gradually gave way to the laughter of families who no longer feared arriving too late to find help. The expanded royal sanctuary stood proudly beside its original stone walls, blending familiar tradition with thoughtful renewal. Bright windows welcomed morning sunlight into spacious treatment rooms. Fresh herbs filled newly built gardens, and comfortable sleeping quarters ensured that neither patients nor healers would spend another exhausting night searching for a place to rest. The changes reached far beyond new buildings. Hope itself seemed easier to find within the walls of Blackwood Citadel. Evelyn Carter walked through the larger sanctuary exactly as she always had, carrying baskets of fresh herbs and greeting every patient with the same gentle smile that had never depended on comfortable surroundings. Younger healers now worked beside her, eager to learn not only how to prepare medicine, but also how to comfort frightened children, reassure worried parents, and treat every visitor with quiet dignity. They often asked how she remained so patient after long hours, and she simply answered that kindness became lighter whenever it was shared. She never mentioned the morning she had awakened inside the Alpha King's chamber. She never claimed credit for the changes surrounding her. To Evelyn, every improvement belonged to everyone who had continued believing that people deserve compassion even during difficult seasons. One clear afternoon, the completed sanctuary welcomed its first official visitors. Citizens from nearby villages gathered outside the entrance while healers proudly opened the new wings for families who had waited years to see conditions improve. Lucian Ashford arrived without unnecessary ceremony, accompanied only by Captain Rowan Hale and a small group of advisors. Instead of walking directly toward the prepared platform, He chose to tour the sanctuary first. He greeted physicians, thanked builders, spoke with recovering patients, and listened carefully to parents describing how much easier it had become to receive care. Everywhere he turned, he found evidence that thoughtful decisions made months earlier had quietly transformed everyday lives. As he entered one of the new healing gardens, he saw Evelyn helping a young apprentice organize freshly harvested medicinal plants. She patiently explained the purpose of each herb while encouraging the nervous student to trust careful observation more than hurried confidence. When the lesson ended, she noticed Lucian approaching and respectfully bowed. He returned the gesture with a warm smile instead of formal distance. "How does the sanctuary feel now?" he asked. Evelyn looked around at the peaceful gardens, the comfortable buildings, and the smiling families enjoying an afternoon free from worry. "It feels like everyone finally has room to breathe," she answered softly. Lucian remained silent for a moment, reflecting on those simple words. They described far more than new construction. They described a kingdom beginning to understand that compassion required space to grow. Later that afternoon, standing before the gathered citizens, Lucian looked across the crowd until his eyes briefly found Evelyn among the healers. Then he spoke with quiet conviction. "A strong kingdom is not measured only by the height of its walls or the size of its treasury. It is measured by how faithfully it cares for the people who care for everyone else." Warm applause spread across the courtyard, but Evelyn lowered her eyes with humble gratitude, believing the words belonged to every healer standing beside her. Lucian knew otherwise. Without seeking recognition, one exhausted Omega had revealed a truth the entire kingdom had overlooked, and because of her quiet compassion, Blackwood Citadel had become stronger than any fortress built of stone alone. Autumn arrived quietly over Blackwood Citadel, bringing crisp morning air and golden leaves that drifted across the stone paths leading to the royal sanctuary. What had once been remembered as a place struggling beneath impossible demands had become a symbol of thoughtful renewal throughout the kingdom. Visitors traveled from neighboring regions not only to receive care, but also to study the new system that allowed healers and patients to work and recover with dignity. Yet, even as the sanctuary flourished, not everyone inside the royal court welcomed the changes without question. During the first royal council meeting after the harvest season, the great chamber filled with nobles, advisors, and regional governors reviewing the kingdom's annual expenditures. Lady Vivian Blackthorne rose gracefully from her seat, her calm expression revealing little of her true concern. "Your Majesty," she began respectfully, "no one doubts the value of caring for our people. However, the recent reforms have required considerable resources. Some members of the council believe these changes were made too quickly after an unfortunate misunderstanding involving a young healer. Important decisions should never be guided by isolated incidents." Several council members quietly nodded in agreement, while others remained silent, waiting for the Alpha King to respond. Lucian Ashford rested both hands upon the polished council table before speaking with the same measured calm that had guided every decision since his return from the northern border. "You are correct about one thing," he said. "A kingdom should never change because of a single mistake." The room became still. Lady Vivian listened carefully, believing his words supported her argument. Instead, Lucian continued. "The changes were not made because one exhausted healer entered the wrong room. They were made because 17 official requests for help remained unanswered over many months. That morning did not create the problem. It revealed the problem." Quiet murmurs spread across the chamber as several advisors exchanged thoughtful glances. Captain Rowan Hale stepped forward and placed the collection of archived sanctuary reports upon the council table. Each document represented another request that had been postponed despite clear evidence that the existing facilities could no longer meet the needs of the kingdom. Lucian looked across the council before continuing. If Evelyn Carter had found an empty bed where she was supposed to, none of us would have noticed how many others had already been forced to go without one. She did not expose weakness through disobedience. She exposed it through honesty. Lady Vivian lowered her eyes toward the reports, realizing that the discussion had moved far beyond a single misunderstanding. The question before the council was no longer about royal protocol. It was about responsibility. An elderly governor slowly stood from his chair and smiled gently. "Your Majesty," he said, My granddaughter received treatment at the expanded sanctuary last month. For the first time in years, she was given a proper room without waiting through the night. Our village will remember that kindness for generations. One by one, other council members shared similar stories from across the kingdom. Families spoke of shorter waiting times. Physicians described better working conditions. Traveling healers praised the additional resources that allowed them to serve more communities. The debate gradually transformed into quiet agreement. By the time the meeting ended, no one questioned whether the reforms had been worthwhile. As the council members departed, Lucian glanced through the tall windows toward the distant sanctuary, where Evelyn could be seen helping visitors find their way through the gardens without any awareness that her name had just been defended before the highest voices in the kingdom. She still believed she was simply doing her job, and perhaps that quiet humility remained the greatest reason she had changed so many lives without ever trying to change her own. Winter arrived with gentle snowfall that covered the rooftops of Blackwood Citadel in quiet white, transforming the kingdom into a place that seemed touched by peaceful light instead of hardship. Inside the expanded royal sanctuary, warm fireplaces crackled throughout the day, while children laughed beneath colorful blankets, and elderly patients rested comfortably beside bright windows overlooking the snow-covered gardens. The crowded hallways that had once forced healers to search endlessly for empty space now welcomed visitors with calm order and quiet dignity. Every room had been carefully designed so that healing felt as important as medicine itself. Evelyn Carter continued her work exactly as she always had, arriving before sunrise to prepare fresh herbs, greet each patient with genuine warmth, and encourage younger healers who still looked to her for guidance. Although many people across the kingdom now recognized her name, she remained unchanged by admiration. She still carried supplies instead of asking others to do it for her. She still remembered every child's favorite story and every elderly patient's preferred cup of tea. To Evelyn, kindness had never been something to earn recognition. It was simply the natural way to meet another person. Lucian Ashford found himself visiting the sanctuary more often than official schedules required. At first, his appearances focused on reviewing construction reports and ensuring that every improvement continued operating as intended. Gradually, those visits became something quieter. He walked through the gardens without formal announcements, spoke with physicians about their daily challenges, listened to families describing their recoveries, and thanked volunteers whose efforts often went unnoticed. More than once, he found Evelyn patiently teaching apprentices beneath the old oak tree that had remained untouched during construction because she believed every place of healing deserved at least one tree older than the people it served. Their conversations remained simple, yet each meeting revealed something new. Evelyn asked thoughtful questions about villages she had never visited because she genuinely wanted to understand how people lived beyond the capital. Lucian spoke about harvests, schools, mountain roads, and small communities that rarely appeared in royal reports. He realized she listened without expecting promises or favors. She simply cared because every distant village represented people whose lives mattered. In return, Evelyn discovered that the Alpha King behind the royal title possessed remarkable patience. He never hurried conversations with frightened children, never ignored quiet voices standing at the edge of a crowd, and never treated ordinary citizens as though their concerns were too small for his attention. Respect slowly grew between them, not through grand declarations, but through countless ordinary moments shared in service to others. One snowy afternoon, they stood together beneath the covered walkway connecting the original sanctuary to the newly completed healing wing. Beyond the stone arches, children built cheerful snow figures while recovering patients watched from nearby benches with grateful smiles. Evelyn looked across the peaceful courtyard before speaking softly. It is difficult to believe this place was once so crowded that people slept wherever they could find room. Lucian smiled thoughtfully. Sometimes we only recognize what needs to change after someone unintentionally shows us what we have failed to see. Evelyn lowered her eyes with quiet humility. I still wish that morning had never happened. Lucian gently shook his head. If that door had remained closed, many other doors might never have opened. Neither of them spoke again for several moments. They simply watched families enjoying a winter afternoon filled with comfort, safety, and hope. No promises were made. No feelings were spoken aloud. Yet within the peaceful silence, Both understood that the strongest connections were often built the same way the sanctuary itself had been rebuilt, one thoughtful choice at a time, until something lasting quietly stood where hardship had once lived. Spring returned to Blackwood Citadel almost exactly 1 year after the night that had quietly changed everything. Warm sunlight poured across the gardens surrounding the royal sanctuary, where flowering trees stood beside the new buildings that had become symbols of compassion throughout the kingdom. Families no longer arrived carrying uncertainty in their eyes. They came knowing they would find skilled healers, comfortable rooms, and people who genuinely cared about their well-being. Apprentices who had once learned beside Evelyn Carter now guided younger students of their own, passing forward the same patience and kindness they had first received from her. The sanctuary had become more than a place where illness was treated. It had become a place where hope was restored every single day. Evelyn walked through the familiar gardens with the same quiet smile she had worn long before anyone outside the sanctuary knew her name. She still paused to speak with every child who looked frightened, still carried baskets of fresh herbs instead of asking others to do so, and still believed that the smallest acts of kindness often lasted longer than the grandest gestures. Nothing about recognition had changed her heart. Across the courtyard, Lucian Ashford watched the peaceful scene unfold while speaking with visitors from neighboring kingdoms who had traveled to study the sanctuary and its remarkable success. They praised the beautiful buildings and efficient organization, but Lucian knew the true foundation could never be measured with stone or written inside official records. After the guests departed, he crossed the garden and found Evelyn arranging young medicinal plants beneath the old oak tree that had remained standing through every stage of construction. For a quiet moment, neither of them spoke. Birds sang softly overhead while children laughed in the distance, filling the peaceful afternoon with the kind of joy that once seemed impossible during those crowded days of the early heat season. Finally, Evelyn looked toward the castle and smiled gently. "Everything feels different now." Lucian nodded. "The kingdom is different now." She laughed quietly before answering. "Sometimes I still think about that morning and wonder how I could have been so careless." Lucian looked toward the royal residence where one small window overlooked the courtyard below. "I have thought about that morning many times as well," he admitted. "Not because someone entered the wrong room, but because it reminded me that a king can only protect what he is willing to truly see." Evelyn remained silent, allowing the words to settle between them. She understood now that the greatest changes rarely began with perfect plans. Sometimes they began with honest people doing their best during difficult moments. As the afternoon sun slowly painted the gardens with warm golden light, Lucian and Evelyn stood together watching healers, families, and children fill the sanctuary with quiet life. No grand promises were necessary. Their shared respect had been built through ordinary days, thoughtful choices, and a common belief that compassion should never depend upon status or circumstance. The wrong door had led to the right future, not because destiny demanded it, but because kindness transformed an accident into hope for an entire kingdom. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson Blackwood Citadel would remember for generations to come. True strength is gentle, and the smallest act of compassion can open a future that no one could have imagined. If this story reminded you that kindness can change lives in ways we never expect, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, share this story with someone who believes compassion still matters, and tell us in the comments what moment touched your heart the most.